and this is one of our initiatives.
This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you, Rogers. This meeting is being recorded. This is one of our initiatives to bring the learning analytics field to a wider audience. And therefore, we invite people to talk about their research and to stimulate discussion about these topics. And we also aim to create a set of videos that can serve as resources for the community. So we will record the session and it will be available afterwards, along with the slides, if the presenters are willing to share that with us. We will share the link to the website where you can find all the videos later on. And today we are your hosts, myself, Anoushka van Leeuwen, and Rogers is also here, and Isabel also in the background. We're happy to have you all here, and the webinar will be structured as follows. First, we will explain a little bit of the communication rules during the webinar. Then we will introduce our speakers, and after their presentation, which will last about half an hour or 40 minutes, we will have time for a Q&A. So first, to let the webinar run smoothly, we have some rules in place. So first, we please ask you to mute your microphone during the talk. And if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat during the talk, and we will collect them, we as the hosts, and ask you to repeat that question at the end. Or if you prefer, you can wait until the talk is over, then raise your hand and ask your question live to the presenters. So that's it for the communication rules. I hope that's all clear. Now, please let me introduce our speakers for today.
Yeah, so I think Anoushka has some issues with the internet, but she'll be back. I'll just take over from here as she comes back. So our speakers today, we have two presenters. They are Iona Jevet and Jacqueline Wong. Dr. Iona Jevet is associate researcher in the Lesbian Institute for Research and Information in Education. She had a quite successful year last year because in 2021, she finished her PhD at the Open University. In her PhD, she developed student-facing dashboards aimed at the development of self-regulated learning skills. She also won the LAC 21 Best Paper Award together with Jacqueline. Jacqueline Wang is a postdoc researcher in the statistics group at Delphi, University of Technology in the Netherlands. She's currently working on the PRISMA project, which focuses on student motivation and learning in the field of maths. Jacqueline has only a month ago defended her PhD thesis. Congratulations in Rotterdam, in which she studied motivation and self-regulation of learning in open online learning environments. So there is a clear overlap between Iona and Jacqueline's work, both focusing on self-regulation processes. And today, Iona and Jacqueline will present their work that won the Best Paper Award at LAC 21. So I'm very excited for this talk, and thank you for being here. And the floor is yours, Iona and Jacqueline.
Thank you, Rogers, for the introduction, and thank you both to Anoushka and Isabel for the invitation. We're quite happy to share again our study, a study that we conducted last 2 years ago, actually, if we were able to present it at LAC. Since then, we've been working on other stuff also together, and we're very happy to also share that part with you today. So our talk has 2 parts. In the first part, we will go again over the paper that for which we got the Best Paper Award last year at LAC, which is a quantum of choice, how learners' feedback monitoring decisions, goals, and self-regulated learning skills are related. And in the second part, we will share with you, give you a sneak peek into what we are working on at the moment. So to start off, the main topic of this webinar are dashboards. Indeed, dashboards are one of the many possible applications of learning analytics, and they were defined as single displays with one or multiple visualizations that contain different indicators about the learners, their learning context, or their learning process. And our work that we present here today is focused on learning analytics dashboards for learners. And we'll present how we investigated how we can design meaningful learning analytics tools that users can easily make sense of. The assumption under which we are building dashboards, and we hope that they work, is that similar to how a dashboard helps drivers to make decisions, learner dashboards are used to provide feedback to learners and help them make decisions, because we expect that once students have this information that we offer them on dashboards, they are able to self-reflect and, if needed, change their learning behavior or change their goals to achieve whatever they wanted to achieve. And a very common question around learning analytics dashboards is, do they actually help learners achieve better learning outcomes? Do they improve the learning experience for learners? Do they provide meaningful support? And the answer to this question is yes and no, depending on which students we're asking. So because of this, a more interesting question to ask is, for whom are dashboards effective? Why are they effective? And in what context or under what circumstances are they effective? Because once we have these insights, we can better understand the drawbacks of existing dashboards, and we can also build tailored designs that cater to the needs of different learners. And this is what we sought out to answer or look into this question. But looking a bit at current drawbacks or shortcomings of current dashboard designs, literature already talks quite a lot about this topic, and we will mention just the ones that we try to tackle in this study and how we try to tackle it. Firstly, most dashboards, okay, I can continue. So firstly, most dashboards display indicators that reflect task level feedback. And this would be mainly what learning resources are used, or what assessment activities are being done, and the outcome or the result of this assessment. And learning analytics dashboards are still rarely informed by learning theory, and they do not provide learners with feedback on effective learning tactics and strategies. Another drawback is that students are rarely consulted in deciding what information should be displayed on student-facing dashboards. And we also know very little of how students interpret these displays, these dashboards, and how they make sense of this information. And the danger here is that we are building tools that carry our biases. For example, we might find it very easy to understand one indicator, and we might find it very actionable, but the same indicator might not be seen in the same way by a first or a final year university student, which are in the end the intended users of the dashboard. And this leads us to our final point, which is the one-size-fits-all designs that have long been criticized. And I think it's a very valuable question to ask here, if, or the question is, what are the different sizes that we should design for? And consequently, what are those designs? So the way that we try to tackle these three shortcomings in the study that we presented here are the following, I guess. So for the first one, we wanted to design a dashboard that does not contain only what learners do, but also how they do it. So for this, we also try to find some indicators that describe learning behavior, not only learning outcome. Regarding the second point, the limited student involvement, We took a different approach than a co-design or a participatory design, because we wanted to gather input from a large sample of students, while also having students interact with the dashboard in an authentic learning setting. So for this, we created a customizable dashboard on which learners could choose the indicators that they wish to monitor. So they could choose the indicators that they wanted to monitor, but they could also formulate and record goals that they had for the course. And finally, there are numerous factors that can influence the effectiveness of a design or of a dashboard. And we actually chose to focus on only two factors that literature shows are associated with achievement. And these are learner goals and self-regulated learning skills. So going back to the question, for whom are dashboards effective, why, and in what context, what we looked at in this study regarding dashboards is meaningful data or information that students find meaningful. We try to understand why they find it that by looking through our results through self-regulated learning, through a self-regulated learning lens. And the context, we said, are learner goals, and later we will elaborate more a bit on this. So in the end, the research questions that we tackle in the study are, if learners have the choice to configure the data that they see on their own dashboard, what data do they first choose to look at or to monitor? Is the relationship between the way that they formulate their goals and the indicators that they choose to monitor, is there a relationship between these two variables? And the third one, is there a relationship between the way learners formulate their goals, their self-regulated learning skills, and the indicators that they choose to monitor? So I will quickly present the widget that we designed for this. This is the unconfigured dashboard. Here is where at the top of the dashboard, the learners can configure their goal. They can add in open text or free text and afterwards save it. In the middle part, they can choose 3 to 6 indicators out of a selection of 12 to configure their widget. And to provide more information about what these indicators mean, once they hover on top of an indicator, they receive a detailed explanation of what that indicator means and most of the time how it is calculated. And at the bottom of the dashboard, we also included the self-regulated learning questionnaire to collect the data that was used only for research purposes, but having the survey included in the dashboard itself, we wanted to make sure that we have a high response rate, which was relatively successful, I would say. Once the student configured the dashboard, this is how it looks like. This is also how it was embedded in a Coursera MOOC. This is where we collected the data in a Coursera MOOC. So once the student saved the goal, it is visible at the top of the dashboard. Also, their indicators were displayed on a spider chart. We chose this visualization because it allows us to visualize multiple indicators in a relatively small space. And students also had options to change or edit either their goal or the indicators that they selected. If you're curious, if you're curious about the indicators that we chose, the 12 indicators that we offer students for selection, these are the ones. They are divided into categories. On the left, we have still content task level indicators where we listed mostly content progress indicators that show what type of activities students interacted with and to what extent they interacted with these activities. So for example, the number of completed course activities, how many graded assignments or reading assignment they submitted, and how many videos they watched. But I think the more interesting part are the process level indicators, where we tried to craft more complex indicators that look at behavior, at learning behavior. We selected these based on literature. So for example, the engagement in discussions, how active students were on the discussion forums, or the final two ones, which are sort of procrastination indicators that show how early in the week students start working on the activities and how close to the deadline they complete the activities. The online presence here is marked with an asterisk because this one, we operationalize it as the time that they spent online in the MOOC. And this is actually
sorry, Iona, please unmute yourself. I was trying to mute participants, not to disrupt.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see. So I was finally talking about the online presence indicator that is marked with an asterisk because this we operationalized as the time spent online. This is how we calculated it. And this is not an indicator that is actually very, is not predictive of achievement or, of achievement, but we did include it here because it is one of the most common indicators used on dashboards. So we wanted to see if students are also interested in this indicator, or we just add it there because it's easy to calculate most of the time or to compute it. Just a few details about the methods that we use in the study. So as I mentioned before, we used Coursera MOOCs to collect the data. The whole widget was designed specifically for the Coursera environment, although it's also transferable to other environments. We had two courses which are a bit different. One of them was assessment in higher education. So the participants in this MOOC were mostly teachers, higher education teachers, or students that were preparing themselves to become teachers. So in general, they were a bit older. They were also highly educated. 1/3 of them had PhD degrees. While the second study was about sustainable development goals and business. So connecting the business domain with sustainable development goals. And here we had usually a younger population of students. They were also highly educated, but not as the students in the other course. For example, most of them had a master's degree and bachelor's degree. This is a summary of all the data that we used in the study and how we coded each data. So for the indicator selection data, we had 12 binary variables, one for each indicator, which were coded as 1 if the indicator was selected and 0 if the indicator was not selected. And out of this, we also computed an indicator that showed how many, or a variable, how many indicators were actually selected on the dashboard, because students could choose between 3 and 6. The goal data, as I mentioned, was submitted in open text by students. So we actually had to code it to in some way. So we choose to look at 3 specific characteristics of the goal. So the first one, if they actually had a learning component, which meant that students were formulating their goals as describing that they would like to acquire knowledge or understanding or skills within the course. While the second component was a performance component, where they mention whether they want to complete the course or acquire a certificate without really explicitly mentioning that they are interested in the content of the course or the topic of the course. And finally, we also looked if the goals had a time frame or a deadline. for achieving their goals. Finally, we also collected self-regulated learning data with a questionnaire. We used 4 subscales to describe these skills. How we analyzed the data, we looked at, for research question 1, we simply looked at frequencies and compared the 2 courses to see which indicators were selected and when. For the second question, where we wanted to look at the connection between the way that goals are formulated and which indicators were selected, we built binomial logistic regressions, one for each indicator, predicting the probability that the indicator is selected. And with the predictors being the presence of the 3 goal components. And for the third research question, we extended the regressions from research question 2 with the 4 self-regulated learning subscales also added as predictors. In terms of numbers, this is the size of the data set that we worked with. For research question 1, we included the data of all learners that set indicators on the dashboard, and this is 401. Of course, not every student also set a goal or filled out a self-regulated learning survey. So we had to reduce this data set to answer research questions 2 and 3, and we were left only with 200, a bit above 200 students for these 2 questions. Now going into the results, which indicators were selected by students? We first look at how many indicators students selected. We were actually quite surprised because we expected that all students will choose 6 indicators, which is the maximum possible because they want to know as much as possible about their own learning. But in one course, so the one, the assessment in higher education, only a bit more than half of the students selected 6 indicators, while in the other course, only 1/3. So this was a first question mark for us. Why did this happen? Next, when we look at which were the most selected indicators, these are the ones highlighted in blue. We see that there is a focus on content progress indicators. So completed course activities or completed graded assignments, but also productivity, which we calculated as the number of activities that are completed on the same day on which they are started. So in a way, also related to completed activities or the term of completed activities. But this was the most popular learning behavior indicator. This visualization shows the most common combinations of 2 and 3 selected indicators. One course is on the left and one course is on the right. And the graphs also illustrate the scarcity of learning behavior indicators in the widget configuration because it's more concentrated on the right side and on the left side, the squares. And the way that we read, we can read these graphs taking the first row. We see that the combination of completed activities and completed graded assignments was selected by 78 learners, which is 39% of the learners. So this is how this visualization should be read. I think a notable difference between the 2 courses, so the one on the left and the one on the right, highlighted by these graphs, is the presence of the second indicator, which is engagement in discussions, which is still not very present, but still a lot more present on the left side, so in the assessment in higher education, than on the right side. Moving on to the second research question, this table lists the distribution of learning, performance, and time components in the goals that the learners formulated in the 2 courses. And what we see is that there is a significant association between the course learner participated in and the presence of a learning component. And when we look at the fine details of the goal formulations, we can see that learners enrolled in the assessment in higher education course mention more frequently the acquisition of skills, while learners in the sustainable development goals course, they were more interested in obtaining knowledge about the topic of the course or understanding concepts and relations between the concepts taught in the course, as well as also applying this in their practice. These are the results of the logistic regressions, predicting whether each indicator was selected or not by the learners. And the results show that there are 3 learning behavior indicators for which we found significant relations, but none of the content progress indicators showed any significant results. And if we look closer at the predictors, in all 3 cases, we see that the single significant predictor is the course in which the learners were enrolled. And the way that learners formulate their goals, so it was not found to be predictive of the indicators that they selected. So to answer research question, to the models that we used in research question 2, we added the 4 self-regulated learning subscale scores as predictors. And what we see is that 3 behavior indicators, for 3 behavior indicators, we obtain again significant models. And if we look in detail at these 3 models, we see again that the course remains a significant predictor. But what we also find interesting is that, for example, for engagement in discussions, a significant predictor is the level of help-seeking skills that students have. So we can say that the more students are aware that they need help, or that they know where to look for help and when to look for help, they are more likely to choose to monitor their engagement in discussions. For the other indicator, which is the timing of completing activities, as I mentioned earlier, this being a procrastination indicator that shows how close to the deadline students finish their activities, we see that metacognitive activities after learning, so more self-reflection and self-evaluation and time management, are also very predictive of whether students choose this indicator or not. So just to summarize our finding, the first thing that we found is that learners focus on content progress indicators and not so much on learning behavior indicators. And we do have several hypotheses why this happened. The first one is that content progress indicators are easier to understand and that they are directly actionable. So students just have to watch another video and the number on the dashboard will increase. Secondly, we think that 12 might not seem a big number to all of us, but it is possible that being confronted with so many options, learners feel overwhelmed. And this phenomenon is known as the paradox of choice. So the more option one has to choose from, the more difficult it is to make a choice. So we assume that maybe learners either gave up or we assume that maybe learners gave up and chose to stick with what is familiar to them, so the content progress indicators. And another plausible explanation refers to feedback literacy, which implies that, among others, learners are able to recognize the value of feedback. And according to Hattie and Timperley's research, task-level feedback, so the content progress indicators, are less effective then process level indicators, which we try to deliver through the learning behavior indicators. So a question to ask here is, does feedback literacy play a role here? And do learners fail to see the value in such learning behavior indicators? Another finding we had is that the way learners formulate their goals does not predict their monitoring choices. But we have collected data only about the decisions learners took and not the motivations behind them. And it is possible that depending on their motivation, they might take different meaning out of the same indicators. And for example, learners might want to master the topic of a course, and they might see the indicator completed activities as a proxy to how much knowledge they acquired so far, while learners who just want to get a certificate might see it as just how much more do they have to do to achieve and get the certificate. Right. Then when we looked more in detail at self-regulated learning, we also found that time management predicts the use of procrastination indicator. And we know from literature that time management is positively associated with academic online achievement. And what our finding shows is that students that do have this skill are more likely to watch out for indicators that describe their time management. And what do we do with learners that don't have these skills, which might be exactly the learners that need most support? And we found a similar result with regards to help-seeking skills that predict engagement in discussions. We know that forums in MOOCs were especially designed as a place to look for help, where students can help each other when the teachers are not able to support that many students with help. So again, what about learners who don't know where to look for help? And finally, we also saw that course is a significant predictor for multiple indicators, constant across multiple models. And here again, we also know that course design might influence what students do in a course. What if it also influences their feedback needs and what they want to monitor in each course? Now I will give the word to Jacqueline to talk a bit about one of the big challenges we found in the course and how we try to solve it.
Thank you, Joanna. But there are two questions in the chat that I thought it would be nice to answer it here because it's based on the first study. So the first question is whether the results relating to indicators are based on what learners first chose and whether we think that there is an optimal number of choices.
Yeah, we looked only at the first choices that students make on the dashboard, because looking at the data, it would have been a lot of data to condense in one paper, for one. And second, we also noticed that many students visited the dashboard only once. So very few students or learners actually changed the choices that they made or the goals. So we found 5 to 10 students that maybe changed or edited their goals or their indicators. So they stuck with it. We're not sure if they stuck with it because they were happy with their first choice or simply because they didn't have any interest in visiting the dashboard anymore. And the second part of the question was
whether there is an optimal number of choices.
We don't know. We just expected that most students will choose the maximum just because this will give them the most information, but it didn't happen to be that way. So we actually don't know why. Following up with some interviews might help us answer that question. But at the moment, we don't have an answer to that.
Yeah,
yeah. I think Ayana and Jacqueline, I would suggest that we proceed with the presentation because the time we may get caught up with time, and then we answer all the questions at the end. I think that will be fine.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll answer the questions later on. So as Ioana has said, from the first study, we see that crafting indicators was a challenge, and it raises a lot more questions on what kind of indicators affect what kind of choices, like what affects the choices that students make, right? So in the second study, we collaborated with a number of researchers as shown on this slide, and I think Manuel is also in the audience. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll answer them later on. So one of the shortcomings in dashboard design is limited to student involvement. Therefore, in this ongoing study, we are working towards defining meaningful feedback in the learner's eyes and its equivalents and the potential indicators that learning analytics can provide. So also in the first part of the presentation, the assumption under which dashboards are typically built is that learner dashboards are used to provide feedback to the learners, and learners are then expected to self-reflect and change their learning behavior when necessary based on this information. So in order for learners to make sense of the information provided to them, this information has to be meaningful for them. And in the first part of the study, we see that there are significant associations between several perceived self-regulated learning subskills, for example, time management and learner's choice of indicators. Also, course design plays an important role. However, those 12 indicators were mainly derived from what is easily accessible from the Coursera dataset. So this made us question, if we are not limited by the data that we can collect from the online environment, what kind of information would be useful for the students? So to do so, we need to investigate the information or tools that students are currently making use of on their own. And we need to know what are their current practice, their needs and want. And this flips the design process. As such, design now becomes guided by the pedagogical need and not the technical limitation of what kind of data that is currently available. So instead of building dashboards under the assumption that learners are expected to enhance their learning based on the information that's provided to them in the dashboards, we now turn our attention to the information that learners expect from the dashboards and how it will support them in their process of learning. So the first question we ask is, what information and tools do students use when studying? Also, where and how do they get this information? And are they missing any pieces of information or feedback that you think will be helpful for them? So with a better understanding of what information students use when studying, our second question is how we can address these needs with learning analytics. So can we cover data? Can we use the data that we have to cover these needs that students want? And can we simplify the way students gather this feedback? Also, how can we make the information more accurate and accessible? So if we do not have data that's currently available, how can we collect additional information or data to provide students with meaningful feedback? So using an exploratory sequential mixed method study, our study consists of a qualitative study where we interviewed students to gain an in-depth understanding of the process that students typically undertake when studying, as well as information and tools that they use to support their learning. So this interview was conducted with 11 psychology students at Erasmus University Rotterdam. And the information that we gathered from the in-depth interview was coded into 42 distinct items describing various pieces of information. So to examine which of these information are relevant for a larger group of students, we conducted a quantitative study where students were asked to rate the importance of these 42 pieces of information. In addition, we examined how students would like the information to be contextualized. So we included a question on which reference frame they would like to see their information being compared to. We also included a self-regulated learning questionnaire to examine the relationship between learners' perceived importance of the 42 items and their level of self-regulated learning. So we started with the qualitative study to gather inputs from the students. And to make sure that our interview is systematic and touches as many aspects and process of the learning as possible, we use Zimmerman's three-phase cyclical model as a theoretical framework for developing the interview script, as well as coding and analyzing the transcripts. So students were guided to respond to three main questions on how they approach learning. What do they do when studying, and to describe any self-evaluation and reflective practices that they engage in. For each main question, we formulated a number of question prompts to elicit further responses from students. We also included a question about information and tools to ask students what they use in each step, and for each process to specifically gather information that we were interested in, so the information and tool that students use. So as an example, for the forethought phase, students were guided to respond on whether they set goals or plan. And if it's not, we're guided to respond on whether they set goals or plans if they were not discussed in the main question. And students were also asked to specify the type of information they use or think might be needed for setting goals and planning. So the same format was applied for the performance and the self-reflection phase. The audio files of the interviews were then transcribed, and each transcript was coded by two researchers to ensure that information was systematically coded and identified from the interviews. So here you can see an example taken from one of the transcripts. And over here, the student has identified information in the form of a study record of what and how long would be useful. Furthermore, the student provided an explanation of how the information would be used. So this was coded as information and tooling for self-reflection, since the student would make use of the information to reflect on whether they are struggling with any of the topics and evaluate whether they have spent enough time on certain topics. So after coding and summarizing the codes from all the interviews, we obtained 42 distinct information types that can be broadly organized into 7 categories. And it is not surprising that students were generally concerned with course requirements, deadlines, and contents of the course, as well as information that were related to learning outcome. But given that we used a semi-structured interview, we also managed to gather information regarding study behaviors. So for example, how students manage their time and how they use learning strategies. And in this category, besides time, students were also concerned with managing their attention. From the interviews, it was noted that students would like to have information that helps them keep track of how productive they are, and this could be monitored in the context of mood, time of day, and environment. Another set of information in this category relates to study strategies. So students mentioned that information of a list of strategies they have used, how often they have used a certain strategy, and how often they try a different study strategy to get better grades might be helpful. So this suggests that there might be a need to provide students with information regarding their study strategies to support their learning process. Another interesting category that surfaced from the coding relates to information that requires some form of interpretation. These types of information help students to monitor how effective or how accurate they are, linking the behaviors to the outcomes. So for example, how study behaviors or study strategies have an effect on their learning. Also information on whether they have followed or changed their planning. So many of the students mentioned planning in the form of a to-do list. Therefore, knowing how well they have followed or changed their plan might give them some information or insights on their learning progress. And finally, in this category, it also relates to information regarding estimation accuracy. And this can be in the form of whether students have spent more than the required time that was recommended or more than the required time that they have planned for. So such information includes a standard set by the course or by themselves, and hence potentially provide students with information to evaluate and adapt their learning. So given that the 42 information items were derived from interviews with only 11 students, we wanted to examine how well the information items would generalize across a larger population. Using the 42 items, we created a survey, and we asked students to rate the importance of each of the 42 items on a 5-point Likert scale, from not important at all to extremely important. We also included a column on I don't know, so that students will not be forced to rate an item if they're not sure what information might mean to them. And for the next part, I'm going to hand the presentation back to Joanna to explain the reference frame and also the overall implications and future directions of these two studies.
Yep, thank you, Jacqueline. So moving on to the second part, which were the reference frame. Reference frame are already an important aspect of dashboard design, and several authors are already looking into this topic. Reference frame are anchor points for comparison that students can use to interpret the information displayed on the dashboard. And we also chose to ask students how relevant they find these different reference frames to understand how we should deliver this information back to students with analytics. For this question, we chose 7 reference frames that are already cited by literature and used in other studies. We have social reference frames, which shows one's data in comparison to their peers in different constellations. We also use goal reference frames, which are goals either set by the teacher, usually the course objectives, or goals set by the learners themselves. And finally, we have the self-reference frame, which allows students to compare their improvement over time. At the moment, we are collecting data and survey responses with psychology students at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, but we plan to collect another data set at TU Delft and at Goethe University in Frankfurt with students from other disciplines as well. And we hope to move beyond research projects towards implementation projects and use the insights that we gained in these 2 studies as input for the design of learning analytics interventions. Finally, 3 learning points that we got, or 4 that we got out of these studies. First one, we really enjoyed working with customizable dashboards because they are a really interesting direction for future research for multiple reasons. They allow us to observe the decisions learners take on dashboards, so we can gain insights into how learners use these dashboards, what aspects they find valuable and which not. And I think what is even more importantly, we can collect information about the context in which these dashboards are used, and even learner characteristics like self-regulated learning skills or use of learning strategies to understand who benefits from using such tools. And we can see customizable dashboards as both intervention as well as measurement instrument. Secondly, with dashboards, we can also look into the effect of student agency, as dashboards, as they are now static displays of information, do not hold a lot of promise, I think, because learners need to take active part in the feedback process. And we find it quite problematic that for dashboards which rely mostly on self-regulated learning as a theoretical underpinning, students are not able to really interact with them, and we do not create opportunities for learners to practice these skills. As we are researching self-regulated learning so passionately in relation to learning analytics, we should also focus on the self in self-regulated learning instead of the system-regulated learning. And of course, learners need to be able to make this decision themselves if we offer them customizable dashboards. But with this, we can assist their development of feedback literacy and data literacy skills. For example, with pre-configured dashboards, or also we could look at nudges, how we can nudge students towards this. And finally, what led us also to the second study was the difficulty of crafting indicators in such a way that they are grounded in learning theory, they are easy to understand, and they can also be computed from trace data that we collect. And this was quite a massive challenge. And in this sense, bringing the learning to analytics, we think that requires a systematic approach to first identify relevant concepts that supports learners in developing better learning strategies from learning sciences. And second, we need to identify or create, if non-existent, meaningful data sources to quantify these concepts. So we are trying to tackle this challenge in the second study, but we are still quite far away from overcoming it to have an answer to this question. So for that reason, we extend an invitation to the whole community. We have published our widget and Coursera log processing code on GitHub. So anybody can take it and extend it or use it as it is. And we would also like to expand the second study to a larger population. At the moment, we have 3 universities that we are thinking of using, or not using, but use as settings to get more information into this. So if you're interested in any of these 2 opportunities, please feel free to reach us.
All right, thank you so much again, Ayona and Jacqueline, for this great presentation. I think we really enjoyed. I enjoyed this presentation and the very interesting findings. I think we have 7 minutes before we end, but we have some questions posted from the audience, and we already have some questions in the chat. And I would ask the audience to post their questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and speak out your question. But first, we had a question from Elizabeth, which hasn't been answered. Elizabeth, do you want me to read your question, or you want to unmute and ask your question?
I'm happy to ask my question. So my question is that, did you spot any trends or patterns in terms of course outcomes or student performance and their choices, like in terms of what the students chose for their dashboard and then how they performed in the course? Or as these were MOOCs, were there not any sort of end of course exams or assessments?
Yeah, that is definitely a thing that we considered and we look into. We are still to analyze that data set, but what I can say is that we won't be able to make any or to see if the dashboard influenced students in any way, because we don't really have a control group. Because we offered the dashboard to all students, it was open to anyone, but students had to agree to participate in the study. And thus we have just a limited data set of students that actually visited the dashboard in one way or interacted with it in one way. So we don't have a group of students that didn't use the dashboard at all, or we do have them, but we cannot use their data to compare it in the study. So that is a bit of a limitation, but nonetheless, we have several ideas to look, for example, if any behaviors in the course correlate with what indicators students would choose. So the same way that we use the self-regulated learning skills, but in our models, but look, for example, at any behavior indicators, if there is anything there. Yeah.
Right. Any other questions for Jacqueline or Ayona? Of course, we had questions from Maria, Cedric, and Scott, and possibly you discussed that. And do you have anything to add on those ones? Like, but I think you answered that already, Ayona, right? Yeah, maybe as the audience, I think it's about. I'm just wondering about. Like, I don't know whether you had this challenge. I've been working with teachers, for example, work on develop dashboards and implement them in a classroom environment. But for example, you talked about how you try to involve students by giving them an opportunity to choose what kind of indicators they actually are interested in. But do you see any kind of tension between, for example, sometimes the needs or what, for example, the students need and the technical ability or the ability to actually present this kind of information in a pedagogically meaningful way for you as a researcher, or even I don't know whether you worked with the technical people in working with these dashboards, but do you see any tension between needs of the users and the actual technical possibilities?
Maybe I'll start here first. I think we started the second study with the idea that, so what if we don't think about what we can get from the system? And sometimes, a lot of times from the technical side, this is, you look at what data you have and what kind of data you want to provide to learners. So I think the second research is exciting in the sense that now we're flipping it. So instead of just thinking about what kind of data that, you know, we can collect from a technical perspective, but to look at what kind of information that students want. So I think our question is about these, whether there is this conflict between the technical side and what students really want, right? Mm-hmm. So I think if we don't just limit ourselves to the technical capabilities, but really go from a pedagogical perspective, we could actually open the discussion on what's actually meaningful for the students. Mm. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
To also add to that, these 42, let's say, pieces of information that we found, they came only from students. And this doesn't mean that these are the only ones that we should be looking at. We also considered maybe expanding this list with findings from literature that look at different types of feedback, or let's call them indicators, to give back to students. Like, for example, content revision that we had on our dashboard does not appear among those 42 items mentioned from students. But we really wanted to see, okay, if we ask students, what do they say? To use as an input to consider when we design dashboards, not necessarily to use whatever came up there in our designs, because not everything is actually possible. For example, some students talked about their emotions, if they're anxious before exams, which is something that we cannot automatically track in data unless we have some prompts for students to input this data themselves in one way or another.
Yeah, just one thing I just want to remind is we would really appreciate having some feedback about the webinar. I just put the link in the chat, so kindly please fill out the form just to tell us how to improve the future webinars, as you know that we have all these series of webinars, so kindly please complete the form to help us improve on how we can run the webinars. Any other questions? I think we are just at it's exactly the time, and I think we are doing very well. And in case you have any questions, of course, we can follow up questions with the presenters. And what I can say is that a very big thank you to our presenters today. And of course, a big thank you for you joining us today. We enjoyed the discussion and hope this session inspired you. Hopefully today's talk has given you a glimpse of the kind of papers presented at LAC. This was the best paper, and I think it's worth, just like the most of the people have said in the chat. And the next LAC conference is coming next month, and you can still register, and we'll have a new webinar every 2 months. So the next webinar is set for April, and we will announce more details soon in the Solar newsletter and through our social media. So feel free to subscribe to the Solar newsletter through the Solar website, and of course, feel free to tell a friend or colleague about the webinars and all the upcoming events. So thank you so much again, and happy to see you today, and hopefully we'll see you again in the future events. Thanks, Anushka, again for coordinating. I don't know whether you have a word before we...
No, just thanks to our speakers for the very interesting talk, and now I'm even more excited for LAC. So thank you for this warming up for us. Hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you for the invitation.